tonight. You're not walking into a warm classroom with soft chairs and coffee breaks. You're stepping into a freezing medieval school where the floor is covered in damp straw, the windows barely keep out the wind, and your teacher carries a birch rod just in case Latin grammar doesn't inspire you enough. Before sunrise, monastery bells drag you out of bed. Your fingers crack from cold while you scratch prayers onto wax tablets beside smoky candles and half-asleep children who smell faintly of wet wool and sheep. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a single week here without complaining. So if you enjoy slow, immersive journeys into the strange realities of medieval life, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now settle in, lower the lights, and let's discover what medieval schools were really like. Hey guys! Tonight you find yourself standing beneath the shadow of a monastery wall while the last of the night mist curls across the frozen ground like pale river smoke. Your boots are heavy with mud from the road, your fingers stiff with cold beneath rough wool gloves, and somewhere beyond the dark stone buildings a bell begins to toll through the winter air, slow and hollow, as though the morning itself is being dragged unwillingly into existence. The smell around you is a mixture of damp hay, chimney soot, wet horse, and the sharp beeswax scent of candles burning behind narrow windows. Frost clings to the edges of the monastery garden, and the straw scattered across the courtyard crunches faintly beneath your feet. A sleepy novice pushes open an oak door just long enough to glare at you with the exhausted expression of someone who's already been awake for prayers since long before dawn. Medieval travel brochures, if such things existed, really would have neglected to mention how often your socks stay wet out here. You probably would not last a week in this cold without complaining loudly at least once before breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, feel free to comment your location and local time as you listen. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bell tolls again. Not quickly, never quickly here. Time inside a medieval monastery moves according to bells, candles, prayers, and weather. Nothing else matters much. Not comfort, not convenience, certainly not sleep. You follow the novice through the gatehouse and into the inner yard, where a thin layer of dirty snow clings to the corners of the stone walls. A dog lies curled beside a stack of firewood, opening one eye only long enough to decide you're not important. Somewhere nearby, a stable boy coughs into the darkness while carrying a bucket of water already crusted with ice around the rim. Ahead stands the school attached to the monastery. Not a separate building exactly, but a cluster of cold chambers pressed against the cloister itself, close enough that the monks can hear if lessons drift into disorder. The windows are narrow slits covered with oiled cloth instead of glass, and smoke leaks from the roof in lazy grey threads. This is where boys come to learn letters, prayers, numbers, and obedience. Mostly obedience. Inside, the warmth is disappointing but technically present. Rushes cover the stone floor in flattened yellow patches that smell faintly of old herbs and damp feet. Some monasteries scatter lavender or mint among the rushes to sweeten the air, though no one can quite agree whether that truly helps or merely gives the rats something pleasant to nest in. You pass rows of rough wooden benches where children already sit half awake beneath heavy cloaks. Most are between 7 and 14 years old. A few rub sleep from their eyes while others quietly mouth prayers into clasped hands. One boy snores softly against the wall until another nudges him awake with a sharp elbow. At the far end of the room stands the schoolmaster beside a small iron brazier that barely warms his own knees, let alone anyone else's. He wears a dark wool robe shiny at the elbows from years of use, and his fingers are stained black with ink. A thin birch rod hangs at his belt with the casual familiarity of a spoon or knife. You immediately understand that this is not decorative. The schoolmaster greets the morning not with enthusiasm but with endurance. Medieval mornings are less about thriving and more about surviving until sunlight becomes visible. The first lesson begins before dawn fully breaks. A monk walks slowly between the benches carrying a beeswax candle, while the students rise together, stiff and shivering. Their voices fill the chamber in uneven Latin prayer, some clear and practiced, others little more than sleepy muttering. You notice quickly that many boys do not actually understand the Latin words they recite. They learn the sounds first, meanings later, sometimes much later. Education here begins with memory before comprehension. The mouth learns before the mind catches up. Some swear that repeating holy words protects the soul from wandering thoughts during sleep. Others believe Latin itself carries sacred power even when misunderstood. Even now, it is hard to tell whether the boys fear forgetting the prayers or fear the rod waiting for those who do. The candlelight trembles against soot-black rafters overhead. Outside, another bell rings from deeper inside the monastery, marking the next hour of prayer for the monks. The rhythm of the entire place moves like breathing. Bells for waking, bells for prayer, bells for meals, bells for study, bells for sleep. A modern person might call this organized. A medieval child might call it unavoidable. The schoolmaster finally motions for the students to sit, though one unlucky boy remains standing after stumbling over a prayer line. The punishment is mild by medieval standards. He must stand near the draughty doorway for the remainder of the lesson, holding his wax tablet against his chest while cold air creeps around his ankles. Frankly, medieval discipline often has the creativity of someone annoyed before sunrise. You settle onto a bench beside two younger boys whose cloaks smell strongly of wet sheep. One of them keeps a small carved charm tied around his neck, a little wooden saint darkened with age and finger grease. Children carry such things often: charms against sickness, charms against drowning, charms against demons that supposedly lurk near crossroads and churchyards. No one fully agrees whether monks approve of these objects or merely pretend not to notice them. The lesson begins with the alphabet, not written beautifully across clean parchment. Of course, parchment costs money. Real ink costs money. Nearly everything connected to learning costs either silver or suffering. Instead, the boys trace letters onto wax tablets using bone or metal styluses. Mistakes can simply be smoothed away with the flat end. Convenient, though less satisfying than dramatically crumpling paper in frustration. The students chant letters aloud in long rhythmic waves. A, B, C. Again. 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 The sound fills the chamber almost hypnotically, blending with the hiss of the brazier and the distant cawing of crows outside. You begin to understand why medieval learning relies so heavily on repetition. Books are rare. Memory must become the library. The schoolmaster walks slowly between rows, correcting hand positions with quick taps against wrists or shoulders. Yet every so often he pauses to quietly help a struggling child form a difficult letter. There is sternness in him, yes, but exhaustion too. He is likely taught the same lessons through 20 winters beside the same smoking brazier. A gust of wind rattles the shutters. One boy mutters that storms mean wandering spirits cross the hills after sunrise. Another insists spirits dislike church bells and avoid monasteries entirely. Those who tell the tale never fully agree, though all seem certain. Spirits prefer cold weather. The dog from outside eventually wanders into the room and curls beside the brazier as if he owns the place. No one objects. Even strict monasteries respect a creature clever enough to find warmth. Hours pass slowly. Candles burn lower. Fingers cramp. Latin prayers rise and fall like distant waves. And as pale morning light finally pushes through the narrow windows, you begin to realize what medieval schools truly are not grand halls of inspiration, but cold, disciplined places built from patience, repetition, hunger, prayer, and endurance beneath the steady tolling of monastery bells. The morning drifts onward with the stubborn slowness of cold honey, and by the time weak sunlight finally reaches the narrow windows, the schoolroom smells of damp wool, melted tallow, and the unmistakable scent of too many people sharing too little fresh air. The rushes beneath your boots have flattened even further under restless feet, releasing faint traces of crushed mint and old mildew whenever someone shifts position, somewhere in the rafters. Unseen pigeons shuffle and coo softly above the lessons below. The boys remain bent over their wax tablets while the schoolmaster moves among them, with the steady patience of a man who has long accepted that learning arrives one aching letter at a time. You glance around the chamber more carefully now that daylight reveals its details. The room itself is hardly impressive. Medieval schools rarely are. The walls are rough stone patched with lime wash that flakes away like old snow. Thin smoke stains stretch upward toward the ceiling where years of candle soot have darkened the beams nearly black. Moisture gathers in the corners despite the small brazier struggling bravely against the cold. A single long table rests near the front, piled with precious objects, scraps of parchment, a horn ink pot stoppered with cloth, several goose-feather quills, and 2 chained books whose metal clasps glint softly in the candlelight. The chains immediately catch your attention. Books here are not merely valuable, they're treasures guarded like relics. A monk once joked, though perhaps not entirely joking, that a careless student trusted alone with a manuscript is more dangerous than a fox in the monastery henhouse. Looking at the chained volumes, you suspect the monks agreed. One of the younger boys beside you stares openly toward the books with something close to fear. He has probably never touched a bound manuscript in his life. Most children here will not. They learn first through voices, memory, and scratched wax. Books belong to masters, monks, nobles, and very fortunate scholars. The schoolmaster finally lifts one of the chained volumes and opens it carefully upon the desk. Every movement feels ceremonial. The students straighten immediately. Even the dog raises his head. The pages are thick parchment, creamy and uneven, edged with faint wrinkles where the skin once stretched upon drying frames. Inked letters march across the page in dark columns, decorated here and there with red initials and tiny flourishes of blue paint. You can smell the parchment from where you sit, dusty, leathery, faintly sour. No one can quite agree whether old books smell comforting or mildly haunted. The schoolmaster begins reading aloud in Latin, his voice low and measured while students repeat the words back in careful rhythm. Some boys follow confidently, others mumble several beats behind. One particularly exhausted child appears to be repeating entirely different prayers by accident, though fortunately the master does not notice, or perhaps chooses not to. Outside the windows, frost slowly melts from the monastery yard. A pair of crows hop near the stable roof while servants carry firewood across the snow-streaked ground. You catch glimpses of ordinary medieval life continuing beyond the schoolroom walls, a woman shaking rugs beside the guest house, a monk hurrying beneath a fur-lined cloak, smoke rising from the kitchens where pottage likely simmers already. Your stomach notices that last detail immediately. Medieval education, you discover, pairs especially well with constant hunger. The lesson shifts from spoken recitation to copying letters. Older boys receive parchment scraps for practice while younger students remain with wax tablets. One apprentice scribe carefully trims a goose quill using a small knife, shaping the nib with surprising delicacy. Quills demand endless maintenance. Too soft, and the letters blur. Too sharp, and the parchment tears. Medieval scribes spend nearly as much time fixing pens as writing with them. You try holding the quill yourself. It splatters ink across your fingers almost immediately. The boy beside you gives a look usually reserved for travellers who fall into obvious puddles. Ink stains cover nearly everyone here: fingers, sleeves, cuffs, sometimes cheeks. A truly dedicated student often appears halfway transformed into a crow. The schoolmaster demonstrates each letter slowly. Thick downward strokes, thin upward turns, tiny precise hooks at the ends. Beautiful handwriting matters deeply in a world where copying text by hand can consume months of labour. Sloppy letters are treated almost like moral failings. Some swear ugly handwriting reflects a disorderly soul. Others suspect it merely reflects cold hands. The benches creak constantly beneath shifting students. They are narrow, backless, and uncomfortable in ways modern furniture designers would probably describe as historically authentic before charging alarming amounts of money for them. A boy near the front squirms too much and earns a sharp rap against the shoulder from the birch rod. Not cruel, not gentle either. Simply ordinary. Discipline settles over the room like another layer of winter clothing. Children sit straighter whenever the schoolmaster passes nearby. Yet despite the strictness, you notice moments of quiet humanity slipping through the cracks. One older student secretly shares a warmer spot near the brazier with a younger boy whose hands have turned nearly white from cold. Another quietly lends his stylus after a classmate drops one and cracks the tip against the floor. Learning here depends on community as much as authority. A sudden gust rattles the shutters again, and several boys instinctively touch small charms hidden beneath their tunics. One mutters a quick prayer against storms. In some regions, people believe strong winter winds carry wandering spirits, searching for open windows or unguarded chimneys. The monks officially discourage such superstitions. Unofficially, many monks avoid whistling at night for exactly the same reason. The morning lesson continues relentlessly. Letters become syllables. Syllables become lines of prayer. The room hums with chanting until the sounds blur together into something strangely soothing. You begin to understand how medieval students memorize enormous amounts of text. Repetition shapes the mind here the way river water shapes stone. Slowly, constantly, without mercy. The candle near the master's desk burns lower, sending tiny rivers of wax down its side. Beeswax candles are expensive compared to common tallow ones, but monasteries prefer them whenever possible, because they burn cleaner and smell sweeter. Tallow candles, by contrast, often carry the faint scent of cooked meat and disappointment. A boy at the far bench suddenly sneezes hard enough to startle half the room. Immediately 3 other students mutter blessings while one traces a quick protective sign against illness. Medieval schools are breeding grounds for coughs, fevers, and mysterious stomach ailments. Close quarters see to that. Folk remedies circulate constantly among students: garlic against sickness, rosemary for memory, onion poultices for headaches. One child insists sleeping with a piece of amber beneath the pillow prevents nightmares before examinations. Even now, it is hard to tell whether such remedies comfort the body or merely the mind. At last the bell rings again from the monastery tower. Every student freezes for half a heartbeat. Then relief spreads visibly across the room. The morning's first lessons are ending. Quills are wiped carefully. Wax tablets stacked. Benches scrape against stone as stiff legs unfold beneath heavy cloaks. Outside, pale, winter sunlight finally touches the courtyard fully, though it brings little warmth. And as you rise with the others, flexing cramped fingers while the dog lazily stretches beside the dying brazier, you realize medieval schools are built not only from books and prayers, but from endurance shared together in cold rooms beneath watchful bells. The bell's echo still lingers faintly in the rafters as the boys file from their benches in stiff, uneven rows, rubbing ink-blackened fingers against wool sleeves and stamping warmth back into their feet. Beyond the schoolroom windows, the monastery courtyard glows pale beneath the weak winter sun, though the cold remains settled stubbornly inside the stones themselves. Medieval buildings have a remarkable ability to remember every unpleasant season they have ever endured. You follow the students into the cloister walk, where narrow arches frame the frost-covered garden at the centre of the monastery. Thin ice clings to the edges of the fountain basin, and a few brittle herbs poke through the soil where the kitchen brothers grow sage, fennel, and feverfew for remedies. One boy pauses to touch a sprig of rosemary hanging beside a doorway before entering again. For memory, he whispers. Rosemary is believed to sharpen the mind. Some swear chewing the leaves before lessons help students remember Latin declensions. Others insist it merely leaves them tasting like roast lamb. Inside the schoolroom once more, the younger pupils settle near the front while older boys move toward the rear benches for copying exercises. Today's lesson belongs to the beginners, the children still learning the strange dance between spoken sound and written symbol. The schoolmaster stands beside the chained book again, though now he closes it firmly and folds his hands into his sleeves. No reading from the manuscript this time. The words must come from memory. A long silence follows before the master speaks a line in Latin, slow and measured. The students repeat it together. Again, again, again. The rhythm fills the chamber almost musically. Medieval education relies heavily on chanting because memory here matters more than explanation. Books are scarce. Voices must become books instead. You listen as the children stumble through phrases from prayers and psalms, many of which they do not fully understand. Meaning arrives slowly in medieval classrooms. Sound arrives first. A little boy beside you mouths the syllables with fierce concentration, his brows drawn tight as though he is wrestling invisible demons directly out of the air. His nose runs constantly from the cold, though he wipes it away with admirable determination. The master paces slowly between the benches. "Louder," he says. The room obeys. Latin rolls against the stone walls in sleepy waves. Outside, crows answer from somewhere beyond the cloister roof. The dog near the brazier lifts his head briefly, perhaps wondering whether this endless chanting might eventually summon food. No one can quite agree how medieval children tolerated such repetition without losing their minds entirely. Perhaps they simply never expected learning to be entertaining. The students recite the alphabet backward next, then forward again. Certain letters receive special attention, particularly those used often in church texts. The master taps difficult sounds carefully with the rod against his palm, not threateningly this time, but rhythmically, like a conductor guiding singers. One older student assists the younger boys by leading responses. His voice has begun to deepen awkwardly, cracking halfway through a prayer and causing several nearby children to snicker into their sleeves. The schoolmaster raises one eyebrow. Silence returns immediately. Even the dog looks judgmental. You notice how physical the learning process feels here. Students sway slightly while reciting. Fingers tap rhythms onto benches. Lips move constantly. Medieval learning enters through the body as much as through the mind. Memory is trained almost like muscle. The master eventually hands around small hornbooks to several younger boys. Each consists of a wooden paddle covered with parchment displaying letters and prayers beneath a thin, transparent layer of horn. They're among the few portable learning tools available to ordinary students. You hold one briefly. It feels worn smooth by countless nervous hands. A child nearby traces the letters carefully with one finger while whispering them beneath his breath. Another closes his eyes entirely during recitation, as though listening for the shape of each word in the air. Some swear that sleeping with lessons repeated aloud beneath the pillow helps knowledge settle permanently into the brain overnight. Others claim dreams become crowded with angry saints correcting pronunciation. Neither possibility feels impossible here. As the chanting continues, the room grows warmer from sheer human breath. Damp cloaks steam faintly beside the brazier. Candle smoke drifts lazily overhead, mixing with the earthy scent of wet wool and rushes underfoot. A monk enters quietly carrying a small basket of birch twigs for the fire. The students straighten automatically as he passes. Monks move through the monastery with an odd mixture of silence and authority, like tall black birds gliding between shadows. The monk pauses beside one struggling boy whose eyes are filled with frustrated tears. Without a word, he places a small dried apple slice beside the child's wax tablet before continuing on. The boy stares at it like treasure. Kindness arrives quietly in medieval places. The lesson shifts again. Now the students must memorize lines from the Psalter, beginning with short verses repeated over and over until the rhythm settles into instinct. Wealthier children sometimes begin schooling, already familiar with prayers learned at home. But poorer students hear many of these words properly for the first time inside monastery walls. You notice one child counting lines on his fingers beneath the bench. Another scratches tiny marks into the wax edge of his tablet to remember difficult sections. Cleverness often survives where comfort does not. Outside, clouds gather again over the monastery roofs. Winter light fades quickly this far north, and though it is not yet midday, the chamber already dims toward grey. The schoolmaster notices immediately. More candles are lit. Beeswax glows golden against the stone walls while shadows flicker behind the students' heads. The room begins to resemble a chapel as much as a classroom. In truth, the difference between the two is often small. Education here serves faith first. Reading exists largely so prayers, scripture, and church law may survive unchanged. Even arithmetic matters because monasteries count rents, tithes, and storehouses. Knowledge belongs to God before it belongs to curiosity. And yet curiosity survives anyway. You see it in the way students glance toward the chained books, in the careful fingers tracing unfamiliar letters, in the questions they almost ask aloud before thinking better of it. One bold boy finally raises a hand. "Master," he says hesitantly, "why is Latin different from the words we speak?" The room falls still. The schoolmaster studies him for a long moment while candlelight flickers across his tired face. Then, surprisingly, he smiles very slightly. Because, he says, holy things are rarely simple. The answer satisfies no one completely, but the lesson moves on regardless. Outside the shutters, wind begins to moan softly through the cloister arches. Snowflakes drift lazily across the courtyard. Somewhere distant, another monastery bell rings through the grey afternoon. The students continue chanting. Voices rise and fall. Candles burn lower. And slowly, almost without noticing it, you begin to feel the strange rhythm of medieval learning settling into your own bones. Repetition, patience, cold fingers, weary eyes, holy words carried through smoky air beneath winter bells. Snow taps softly against the shutters by the time the afternoon lessons begin, the sound so faint it almost blends with the endless murmur of Latin recitation. The candles have burned low enough that thick tiers of beeswax harden along their sides like pale yellow roots, and the brazier now gives off more smoke than warmth. Still, no one complains aloud. Medieval children learn early that discomfort is not considered remarkable enough to mention. The students return slowly to their benches after a short pause in the cloister, boots carrying fresh mud and traces of snowmelt onto the rush-covered floor. Cloaks drip near the doorway, fingers reddened by cold flecks stiffly around styluses and quills. The schoolmaster watches all of this in silence. You've begun noticing how carefully he observes the room. Not merely the lessons, but the students themselves, who whispers too often, who struggles with letters, who grows sleepy after prayers, who hides bruised knuckles beneath sleeves. His gaze misses very little. At first glance, he seems built entirely from discipline and disappointment. Yet the longer you remain here, the more complicated he becomes. His name, you overhear eventually, is Master Aldrich. He has likely taught in this same chamber for decades. His robe smells faintly of smoke and damp parchment. Ink stains mark nearly every finger joint, and a thin scar cuts across one eyebrow, though no one explains how he got it. Some boys whisper he once travelled with cathedral scholars in distant cities before returning to monastery life. Others insist he angered a nobleman and fled into teaching instead. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. Master Aldrich resumes the lesson with little ceremony. He calls students one by one to stand before the class and recite memorized passages. Each child approaches differently. One boy speaks clearly but trembles visibly throughout. Another recites quickly in hopes of escaping attention before making mistakes. A third forgets halfway through and stares helplessly at the floor while silence thickens around him. The master waits. Not kindly, not cruelly either. Simply waiting. The poor child finally stammers the correct line after several painful moments and nearly collapses with relief returning to his bench. Embarrassment, you realize, serves as its own medieval teaching method. A stronger gust rattles the shutters hard enough to extinguish one candle near the rear wall. Several boys flinch instinctively. One quickly traces the sign of the cross against his chest. Storms unsettle people here. Some swear demons wander most freely during winter weather, especially when wind whistles through narrow gaps in old stone. A stable hand apparently claimed last year he heard voices speaking beneath the monastery bridge during a snowstorm, though others suggested he had simply consumed heroic amounts of ale. Frankly, both explanations seem possible. Master Aldrich relights the candle without comment and continues the lesson. Now comes writing practice. Older students receive parchment scraps while younger boys continue with wax tablets. Quills scratch steadily across the room like tiny claws. Ink pots pass carefully from bench to bench under the master's watchful eye, because spilled ink wastes precious supplies and destroys tempers equally fast. You attempt a line yourself. The quill catches. Ink splatters sideways. A nearby student quietly slides the parchment farther from danger before you can ruin the entire sheet. Wise child. Master Aldrich notices anyway. He steps beside you, studies the crooked letters, then wordlessly adjusts your grip on the quill. His fingers are cold and rough from years of handling parchment during winter months. Slowly he says, "That is all." Yet somehow the next line improves. You begin to suspect medieval teachers survive mainly on exhausted patience and stubbornness. The room settles into concentration. Outside, snow continues drifting through the cloister yard while distant monastery bells mark another passing hour. The rhythm of study, prayer, and cold seems endless now, like the steady turning of some ancient wheel. Then comes the interruption everyone fears. A boy near the front bench starts whispering. At first it is harmless enough, a joke perhaps, maybe a complaint about frozen fingers. But the whisper grows into muffled laughter, and suddenly 3 students are grinning openly behind their sleeves. Master Aldrich stops writing immediately. Silence spreads through the room with frightening speed. Even the fire seems quieter. The master walks slowly toward the bench. No raised voice, no dramatic anger. Somehow that feels worse. The guilty boys stare downward. One of them still smiles faintly, though panic now creeps visibly into the edges of it. Master Aldrich lifts the birch rod from his belt. The room remains utterly still. Punishments in medieval schools vary wildly depending on the master, the monastery, and the offence. Some are harsh enough to make modern parents faint directly onto expensive carpets. Others rely more on humiliation, extra prayers, or uncomfortable chores. Today's punishment is measured but memorable. The boys must kneel near the doorway holding heavy books above their heads while the lesson continues around them. Cold draughts creep beneath the door constantly, and before long their arms begin trembling with effort. No one laughs now. The discipline is public by design. Medieval education believes strongly that shame improves memory. Whether this is truly effective or simply miserable remains difficult to say. Still, Master Aldrich does not appear to enjoy the punishment. If anything, he looks weary while returning to the front of the room. The rod disappears once more into his belt untouched. A younger student nearby whispers prayers under his breath while copying letters. You notice tiny charms stitched into several tunics now that cloaks have loosened indoors, little crosses of rowan wood, saints carved from bone, scraps of cloth wrapped around supposed relic fragments. Children bring fear with them into the classroom alongside ink and wax tablets. Illness especially terrifies medieval families. Fever can arrive suddenly and carry off a healthy child within days. Some mothers sew protective prayers directly into shirt collars. Others burn herbs before examinations to calm nerves and ward away evil influence. One boy claims sleeping beside fox teeth improves memory. No one entirely believes him. No one entirely dismisses him either. As afternoon deepens, the lessons grow quieter and more difficult. Younger children fight sleep openly now. One nods forward so sharply his forehead nearly strikes the bench. Another startles awake after drifting off mid-prayer, reciting the final line far too loudly and causing half the room to jump. For the first time all day, Master Aldrich actually chuckles. A tiny sound. Barely there, but enough to transform the room briefly. The students relax for half a heartbeat before discipline settles back into place once more. Outside, twilight already darkens the monastery yard. Smoke rises blue-grey against the falling snow while servants carry lanterns between buildings. Somewhere distant, the kitchen bell rings faintly. Supper approaches. The students know it immediately. Energy shifts through the room like restless birds. Hunger sharpens every face. Master Aldrich closes the chained manuscript carefully and extinguishes one candle with damp fingers. The day's lessons are nearly done, and as you watch the weary schoolmaster standing beneath smoke-black rafters, while tired children gather tablets and quills around him, you begin to understand that medieval schooling rests not only upon fear or discipline, but upon endurance shared daily between exhausted teachers and equally exhausted students beneath the slow, turning rhythm of monastery bells. The kitchen bell echoes through the monastery like a promise carried on cold air, and immediately the mood inside the schoolroom shifts. Not wildly, of course. Medieval children rarely explode into joyful chaos the way modern ones might. There is too much discipline baked into daily life for that. But shoulders loosen, eyes brighten faintly. Even the boys kneeling near the draughty doorway glance upward with desperate hope. Hunger governs medieval schedules nearly as firmly as prayer. Master Aldrich dismisses the students with a tired wave of ink-stained fingers, and benches scrape against stone as the boys rise stiffly from their places. Wax tablets are stacked carefully, quills wiped and bundled. One student nearly forgets his hornbook in his rush toward food, and doubles back so quickly he slips on crushed rushes, catching himself against the wall with all the dignity of a startled goose. A few muffled laughs ripple through the room. The punished boys are finally released from their kneeling. Their arms hang uselessly for several moments while blood painfully returns to their fingers. One mutters a prayer of thanks to St. Lawrence, patron of cooks and, apparently, exhausted schoolchildren everywhere. You follow the others through the cloister toward the refectory, where supper waits beneath low timber beams darkened by generations of smoke. The warmth reaches you first. Real warmth this time, thick with the scent of onion pottage, coarse bread, damp wool steaming dry, and something faintly fishy simmering in iron pots near the hearth. It smells magnificent, which says less about the food and more about how cold you've been all day. Long wooden tables stretch through the hall, lit by clusters of candles that throw soft gold against the walls. Monks eat separately nearer the front while students and servants gather farther back in noisier groups. The dog from the schoolroom trots confidently between benches like a creature fully aware nobody here possesses the emotional strength to deny him scraps. A novice ladles pottage into rough wooden bowls one by one. The meal is simple, thick oat stew with onions, cabbage, and a few precious shreds of smoked fish floating sadly near the surface. Beside it rests dark rye bread, hard enough to qualify as defensive equipment in certain circumstances. Still, every student attacks the food with alarming focus. You settle onto a bench between two boys still smelling strongly of cold air and ink. One crosses himself before eating. The other begins immediately, apparently trusting God to understand urgency. Conversation remains muted at first. Medieval meals often involve readings or prayer, especially inside monasteries. Tonight a weary monk near the hearth recites passages from a saint's life while everyone eats. His voice drones steadily through the room. Though most listeners seem more spiritually connected to their bowls than the sermon itself, no one can quite agree whether medieval saints performed more miracles or inspired more distracted dinner audiences. The pottage is hot enough to sting your tongue, but the warmth spreads wonderfully through numb fingers and chilled stomach alike. Nearby students tear bread into the stew to soften it. One carefully hides a crust inside his sleeve for later. Hunger teaches long-term planning remarkably fast. You begin noticing small differences among the boys gathered here. A few wear finer wool tunics trimmed neatly at the cuffs. Merchant sons, perhaps. Minor nobles occasionally send younger children to monastery schools too, especially if they hope one day to place them within the church. Poorer students wear patched clothing, stiff from repeated mending. One child's boots are so cracked at the toes you can glimpse wool wrappings beneath. Yet all eat the same meal tonight. Mostly. One older student receives an extra piece of smoked fish after helping in the scriptorium earlier. Several boys watch him with the quiet resentment normally reserved for tax collectors and fortunate cousins. Food hierarchies survive everywhere. At the far end of the table, two younger students whisper nervously about tomorrow's recitations. One insists Master Aldrich remembers every mistake forever. The other claims the master once made a boy copy prayers for 3 straight days after mispronouncing a saint's name. A third student leans closer. My brother says a cathedral teacher in York beat a student with an eel. The table falls briefly silent. Fresh or salted, someone finally asks. Honestly, that feels like the correct question. Laughter spreads quietly along the bench before quickly fading as a monk glances their direction. Outside, snow continues drifting past the narrow windows. The monastery bells ring again somewhere beyond the refectory walls, softer now beneath the muffled weather. Time here moves endlessly from bell to bell, prayer to prayer, meal to lesson. A servant passes carrying a jug of weak ale diluted heavily with water. Even children drink small amounts because clean water cannot always be trusted. Brewing kills impurities medieval people do not fully understand but wisely fear anyway. One boy whispers that stagnant wells sometimes become cursed after storms. Others claim frogs living near the bucket ropes cause fevers. Even now, it is hard to separate practical caution from superstition. The monk reading aloud reaches a dramatic portion of the saint's story involving visions, fasting, and a suspiciously large raven delivering bread from heaven. Several boys listen with renewed interest at the mention of bread. You suspect miracles involving pastries would attract enormous medieval devotion. As the meal continues, warmth slowly softens the room. Steam curls upward from bowls, wet cloaks dry beside the hearth. Candlelight flickers against sleepy faces while the storm outside deepens toward evening. One student quietly pulls from his pocket a tiny pilgrim badge made of cheap pewter, stamped with the image of St. Cuthbert. He rubs it before tomorrow's lessons for luck. Another boy keeps a rabbit foot tied secretly beneath his tunic, despite monks insisting such charms encourage pagan nonsense. The monks object. The students continue carrying them anyway. After the bowls are emptied, students scrape remaining crumbs carefully into their mouths. Waste is nearly sinful in winter months. A younger child even wipes the inside of his bowl with bread before eating the bread itself. Efficient and delicious. The dog receives several scraps beneath the benches and promptly falls asleep beside the hearth with the satisfaction of a creature who has mastered medieval survival better than most humans. Gradually the refectory quiets. The reading ends. Students lean back heavily against benches while warmth and full stomachs battle against overwhelming exhaustion. Outside, darkness settles fully over the monastery now. Snow gathers silently against the cloister stones. Lanterns glow faintly beyond the windows where servants finish evening chores in the yard. Tomorrow the lessons will begin again before dawn. More chanting, more cold benches, more Latin prayers repeated until they sink into memory deeper than thought itself. But for now there is food, warmth, candlelight, and the rare comfort of simply sitting still while winter presses harmlessly against thick monastery walls. And as you watch tired students rubbing cramped hands beside empty bowls while bells toll softly through the snowy dark, medieval schooling begins to feel less like a grand pursuit of wisdom and more like a long shared endurance carried together one cold meal at a time. By the time supper ends, the monastery has settled into that strange medieval hour between labour and sleep, when candlelight replaces daylight entirely and every stone corridor seems softer somehow beneath the drifting smoke of hearth fires. Snow still falls beyond the cloister arches, though more gently now, and the wind has quieted to a low murmur against the outer walls. You follow the older students back toward the schoolroom carrying a small tallow candle that sputters whenever cold draughts creep beneath the doors. The younger boys have been dismissed for evening prayers and sleep, but several older pupils remain for additional instruction. These are the sons of merchants, stewards, clerks, and ambitious families who hope literacy alone might one day pry open a better life. Not everyone studies only prayers here. Some study survival. The schoolroom feels different at night, smaller somehow, more secretive. Shadows crowd the corners where the candlelight cannot fully reach, and the soot-black beams overhead vanish almost entirely into darkness. The brazier glows dim red now, surrounded by tired students warming stiff hands while Master Aldrich arranges a handful of wooden counters across the front table. Arithmetic tonight. A collective groan almost rises from the benches before discipline crushes it flat. Numbers in medieval schools are rarely abstract things floating politely across clean paper. They belong to grain tallies, tax records, market tolls, wool accounts, rents owed to lords, barrels stored for winter, and debts nobody wishes to discuss loudly near their fathers. Master Aldrich places small bone counters into careful rows. 3 hens sold at market, he begins, for 2 pennies each. Several boys already look distressed. The master continues anyway. You watch the students lean forward beneath the candlelight, fingers moving silently over tally sticks and scratched wax tablets. Roman numerals appear everywhere, stubborn and awkward. Medieval arithmetic has an unfortunate tendency to resemble tiny fence repairs performed by exhausted monks. One merchant's son beside you solves the problem quickly using pebbles hidden in his sleeve. Another student counts silently on his knuckles beneath the table, with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. No one can quite agree whether medieval mathematics builds character or merely creates headaches. The counters click softly against wood while outside the monastery bells toll once more through the snowy night. Everything here happens beneath bells. Even numbers seem to obey them. Master Aldrich introduces weights and measures next. How many loaves from 2 sacks of grain? How much ale from 1 barrel? How many candles can be made from 12 pounds of wax? Practical knowledge matters deeply in medieval life because mistakes have real consequences. Miscount rents badly enough and a lord grows angry. Misjudge grain stores and people starve before spring. A student near the front mutters that his father once lost an entire sheep because of poor counting during a market dispute. How another whispers, he forgot which sheep was his. Frankly, medieval markets do sound exhausting. The lesson shifts toward tally sticks, now lengths of wood notched carefully to record debts and payments. Master Aldrich passes several around while explaining how stewards and traders track accounts across seasons. Each notch carries meaning, large cuts for pounds, smaller ones for shillings and pennies. The sticks look deceptively simple. A nearby student quietly admits he trusts tally sticks more than written records because wood does not lie. An older boy immediately replies, "People holding the wood certainly do." That earns the faintest twitch of amusement from Master Aldrich before he resumes the lesson. You notice how differently the older students behave compared to the younger children from earlier lessons. Less chanting now, more calculation, more exhaustion too. Several already carry responsibilities beyond school, assisting fathers at markets, copying records for local priests, helping manage storehouses before dawn lessons even begin. Education here is not childhood separated from adulthood. It is preparation for it. A servant enters briefly carrying a small basket of dried chestnuts for the evening students. The gesture transforms the room instantly. Tired boys sit straighter while chestnuts pass from hand to hand like tiny treasures. One student pockets half his portion for a younger brother sleeping in the dormitory. Another hides his entirely until the master looks away. Reasonable strategy. Master Aldrich begins explaining market calculations involving cloth lengths and toll payments collected at town gates. Merchant sons follow eagerly. One noble-born student less so. He stares at the counters with the expression of a man being personally insulted by mathematics. Some swear noble children purposely pretend confusion during merchant lessons because trade seems beneath them. Others suspect numbers simply become terrifying after enough Latin prayers. The candle beside you flickers low. Wax drips onto the table. Outside the shutters, snow has stopped entirely now, leaving the monastery wrapped in deep winter silence. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rattles faintly along the frozen road beyond the walls. Perhaps merchants arriving late, perhaps pilgrims seeking shelter. Medieval roads rarely sleep completely. Master Aldrich scratches figures onto a wax tablet and calls students forward individually to solve them. One boy freezes entirely under pressure, forgetting even basic sums he clearly knew moments earlier. The master sighs softly. Then, unexpectedly, he kneels beside the student rather than scolding him. "Slowly," he says again, the same word he used correcting your writing earlier. Together they move the counters one by one until the answer appears. The boy nearly glows with relief. You are beginning to understand that Master Aldrich teaches less through inspiration than persistence, like rain wearing stone smooth. A faint smell of rosemary drifts suddenly through the room. One student has crushed leaves between his fingers while working calculations, for memory again. Another student quietly ties a knot in the edge of his sleeve before a difficult problem. Certain medieval scholars believe knots help trap knowledge long enough for the mind to grasp it properly. Others insist knots merely trap sleeves on door handles. The lesson continues deeper into the evening. Students calculate rents owed after poor harvests, candle costs for winter monasteries, grain measurements for baking bread. The arithmetic reveals the hidden machinery beneath medieval life, every loaf counted, every barrel measured, every coin painfully earned. You realize most people here cannot afford mistakes because there is almost no cushion against hardship. Winter remains close outside these walls, patient and hungry. Eventually the counters are gathered away, wax tablets stacked, tally sticks bundled together with cord. The older students rub tired eyes while stretching cramped backs beside the dying brazier. One yawns so enormously the dog sleeping nearby startles awake in alarm. Master Aldrich dismisses them quietly. No speeches, no praise, only another long day finished beneath monastery bells. And as you step into the cold cloister once more beside weary students carrying candles through drifting smoke and winter silence, you begin to see how medieval schools taught not only prayers and letters, but the careful calculations needed to survive a world forever balanced between scarcity and endurance. The night settles heavily over the monastery after the older students finish their arithmetic, wrapping the stone buildings in silence broken only by distant bells and the faint hiss of snow sliding from rooftops. Lantern light glows softly beneath archways while monks drift like dark shadows through the cloisters on their final rounds before sleep. You expect the schoolrooms to empty completely now. Instead, a small side chamber near the kitchens remains lit. Curious voices drift from behind the half-open door. Not boys this time. Girls. You pause outside quietly while warm candlelight spills across the worn stones of the corridor. Inside sits a very different sort of lesson from the ones filling the monastery school earlier in the day. The room itself is smaller and warmer, with woven rush mats scattered over the floor and herbs hanging from rafters to dry. Lavender, sage, and rosemary soften the smoky air. Several girls sit gathered near an older nun whose grey sleeves are patched neatly at the elbows. A spindle turns lazily in one student's hands, while another bends over embroidery stretched across a wooden frame. Near the hearth, a young noble girl traces letters carefully into a wax tablet with fierce concentration. The atmosphere feels gentler than Master Aldrich's schoolroom. Not easier, just different. In medieval life, girls' education depends almost entirely on birth, wealth, family ambition, and sheer luck. Most peasant girls learn practical household skills from mothers, sisters, and grandmothers rather than formal schools. Bread baking, brewing ale, tending geese, mending wool, keeping winter stores dry, managing herbs for sickness. Knowledge passed hand to hand instead of written page to page. Yet in convents and noble households, some girls receive instruction in reading, prayers, music, and even writing, not commonly, not equally, but enough that scattered learned women appear quietly throughout the medieval world like candles burning in forgotten corners. You slip inside unnoticed at first. The nun reads softly from a prayer book while several girls repeat the Latin words together. The rhythm sounds familiar now after hours spent among the monastery boys, though the voices here are quieter, steadier somehow. One girl no older than 10 recites perfectly while stitching tiny blue flowers into linen cloth. Another struggles badly with pronunciation and keeps glancing nervously toward the nun's face after each mistake. The nun corrects her patiently. No birch rod, just repetition. A remarkable innovation, honestly. The noble girl near the fire catches your attention most. Her cloak is trimmed with fur despite the modest room, and silver thread glimmers faintly along her sleeves. She practices writing letters onto wax with careful precision, while a servant girl beside her watches openly in awe. The servant likely will never learn more than a few prayers by memory. The noble child may someday manage estates, correspondence, and household accounts during her husband's absence. Education follows rank as faithfully as shadows follow candlelight. Outside the small windows, the monastery bell tolls once for the late hour. The sound rolls softly across snowy rooftops while the girls continue working beneath the dim glow of beeswax candles. One older student reads aloud now from a psalter in halting Latin. Her voice trembles slightly but grows stronger with each line. The younger girls listen carefully while sewing needles flash silver in the firelight. Needlework matters deeply here. Not merely decoration but survival. Girls learn stitching alongside prayers because clothing tears constantly in medieval life. Wool frays, cloaks split, blankets wear thin during endless winters. A skilled seamstress becomes as valuable as a good steward. Some swear uneven stitches invite bad luck into a household. Others claim crooked hems offend certain saints. Even now, it is hard to tell where superstition ends and habit begins. The nun eventually closes the prayer book and begins teaching herbal remedies instead. Small bundles appear on the table: mint, yarrow, chamomile, thyme. For coughs, she says, holding one sprig. For fevers. For restless sleep. The girls repeat each herb's use aloud, much like the boys memorizing Latin earlier. Medieval education always circles back to memory because books remain rare, and life allows little room for forgetting important things. One child asks whether rosemary truly improves learning. The nun smiles faintly. It helps if you study also. A devastating response. You notice several girls carry small protective charms hidden beneath sleeves or tied quietly at the wrist. Tiny saints carved from wood, knotted cords blessed during feast days, little cloth pouches filled with herbs against illness. Monasteries officially encourage faith over superstition. Unofficially, medieval people trust both whenever possible. The servant girl finally gathers courage to try writing her own name on the wax tablet. Her tongue peeks from the corner of her mouth with concentration, while the noble girl beside her quietly guides the stylus. Slowly, carefully. The letters emerge crooked but recognizable. The servant stares at them in amazement. For a brief moment, the entire room seems to pause around that tiny achievement. Because writing your own name in the medieval world means something powerful. It means existing in records instead of merely being spoken about by others. It means contracts, letters, signatures, prayers copied by your own hand. The nun notices the moment too. She says nothing, but her expression softens gently in the candlelight. Outside the chamber, footsteps echo through the corridor as monks pass toward evening prayers. Somewhere distant, a door slams against winter wind. The monastery never fully sleeps. Bells continue marking hours through darkness whether anyone wishes to hear them or not. The girls return to sewing now while the nun tells stories of female saints, abbesses, and noblewomen known for wisdom. Some stories sound historical, others suspiciously legendary. One tale describes a nun who supposedly memorized entire books after seeing a vision during fever. Another claims a queen once disguised herself as a monk to study secretly in cathedral schools. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether she succeeded or was immediately recognized because she smelled too pleasant. Honestly, medieval scholarship probably did smell terrible. The candles burn lower. Yawns spread quietly through the room. One younger girl nearly falls asleep against her embroidery frame before jerking awake again. The servant girl keeps tracing her written name repeatedly into the wax as though afraid it might vanish if she stops. At last the nun gathers the tablets and prayer books away. Lessons end not with harsh commands but soft reminders for morning prayers and warm cloaks against the cold corridor draughts. The girls rise slowly, stretching cramped fingers while candles flicker low around them. And as you step back into the dark monastery hallway listening to their quiet voices fade towards sleeping chambers beneath distant winter bells, you begin to understand how medieval girls learned mostly at the edges of formal education through convents, households, whispered lessons, and rare patient moments carried carefully through a world that often expected them only to listen, sew, and remember. Morning returns reluctantly to the monastery. A grey mist hangs low over the cloister garden, softening the outlines of bare winter branches while frost clings silver-white to the stone fountain at the centre. Somewhere beyond the walls a rooster attempts optimism far earlier than anyone appreciates. And the first bell of the day rolls through the cold air like a warning rather than an invitation. You wake beneath a coarse wool blanket in the student dormitory, where the smell of damp straw, old leather boots, and lingering smoke has settled permanently into the timbers. Around you, boys groan quietly into the darkness while fumbling for cloaks and half-frozen shoes. One child sleeps so heavily another must physically roll him off the straw mattress. A difficult but effective educational technique. Soon enough you are back crossing the cloister beneath pale dawn light, following students toward morning prayers and another long day of lessons. Snow crunches beneath boots, breath clouds the air. The dog from yesterday trots beside the group carrying what appears to be half a stolen sausage with tremendous pride. Inside the schoolroom, candles flicker weakly against the gloom while Master Aldrich speaks quietly with a monk you have not seen before. This monk is older, much older. His shoulders bend slightly beneath thick black robes, and ink stains darken his sleeves so deeply they seem permanent. Tiny cuts mark his fingers where parchment edges have sliced the skin over many winters. Around his belt hangs not a birch rod but a cluster of keys heavy enough to sound like distant bells whenever he moves. Students straighten immediately upon seeing him. Even Master Aldrich looks respectful. You soon learn why. This is Brother Odo, keeper of the monastery library. The room falls unusually silent as he studies the students one by one with pale, watery eyes. He looks less like a librarian, and more like a man who personally remembers the invention of books. Brother Odo speaks rarely, but when he does, every child listens. 2 boys, he says finally, voice dry as old parchment, to assist in the library. Immediately every student sits straighter, even the sleepy ones. Working near the library means warmth, candles, and perhaps the rare chance to touch real manuscripts. It is the closest thing medieval children possess to entering a treasure vault. Master Aldrich selects 2 older students after a long pause. One beams with pride, the other looks terrified. Reasonable response. To your surprise, you are permitted to follow. The library lies deeper inside the monastery, behind thick oak doors banded with iron. Brother Odo unlocks them slowly while the keys clink softly in the corridor. The smell reaches you first. Dust, wax, leather, dry parchment, and beneath it all the faint earthy scent of old wood and centuries of trapped smoke. The chamber itself is smaller than expected, yet somehow enormous in feeling. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with bound manuscripts wrapped in cloth or chained carefully in place. Candles burn low beside reading desks worn smooth by generations of elbows and tired hands. Here rests the true wealth of the monastery. Not gold, not silver, words. Books in the medieval world are unimaginably expensive. One large manuscript may require the skins of dozens of sheep or calves, months of copying, and pigments worth more than many families earn in a year. A careless candle could destroy fortunes in a single night. No one can quite agree whether monks fear fire, damp, or clumsy students most. Brother Odo moves through the room with reverent precision. He handles each volume as though touching relics. The students assisting him immediately begin dusting shelves and trimming candle wicks beneath his careful supervision. You wander slowly beside a reading desk where a manuscript lies open beneath weighted cords. Illuminated initials curl across the page in blue and red flourishes. Tiny gold details shimmer softly in the candlelight. It is breathtaking and deeply intimidating. A younger monk nearby scrapes parchment clean with a curved knife, removing old text so the skin may be reused. Parchment is too valuable to waste. Many manuscripts become palimpsests this way, older writing buried faintly beneath newer words like ghosts refusing to disappear entirely. Some swear erased texts still whisper themselves aloud on stormy nights. Others suspect monks working too late simply grow imaginative from lack of sleep. Brother Odo notices your fascination with the illuminated page. "Do not breathe too hard near it," he mutters. An excellent summary of medieval manuscript care. At the far end of the library, scribes sit copying texts line by line in near silence. Goose quills scratch steadily, while tiny pots of ink rest beside sharpened knives. Rulers, pumice stones, and pigments ground from minerals or plants. One scribe paints delicate blue flowers curling round a capital letter. Another carefully copies legal records for nearby manor courts. Everything here moves slowly, painstakingly. One mistake can ruin days of work. A student assisting beside you accidentally bumps a table and nearly knocks over an ink pot. The entire room freezes. Brother Odo closes his eyes briefly like a man enduring spiritual pain. Fortunately, disaster is avoided. Barely. The student may never recover emotionally. You notice the library contains more than religious books. There are histories, herbals, collections of saints' lives, law texts, calendars marking feast days, and even strange bestiaries filled with creatures both real and imagined. One manuscript illustration shows a lion fighting a dragon while monks calmly watch nearby. Accurate medieval energy, honestly. Brother Odo allows you to examine a herbal briefly. The pages describe remedies involving honey, onion poultices, dried herbs, vinegar washes, and leeches applied with alarming enthusiasm. A note in the margin warns that too many leeches may weaken both body and spirit. Useful clarification. Outside the narrow library windows, snow begins falling lightly once more. The world beyond the monastery fades toward white silence, while inside the candles glow steadily against rows of chained knowledge. You begin to understand why medieval libraries feel sacred. Most people in the world outside these walls will never enter such a room. Many will never see a complete book at all. Knowledge here exists physically, heavily, vulnerably. It must be copied by hand, protected from moisture, guarded from theft, and remembered constantly. A bell rings faintly somewhere deep in the monastery. Brother Odo sighs. Back to lessons soon. The students helping him carefully cover the open manuscripts with cloth before extinguishing several candles. Every movement feels ritualistic, deliberate, protective. As the great oak doors close behind you once more and the keys clink softly at Brother Odo's belt, you realize medieval schools are not merely places where children learn lessons, but gateways standing beside fragile islands of knowledge, preserved carefully against cold, fire, war, and forgetting itself. The snowfall thickens through the afternoon until the monastery seems to float inside a world made entirely of grey sky and white silence. From the narrow schoolroom windows you can barely see the outer wall anymore. Only vague shapes moving through curtains of drifting snow monks, crossing the cloister beneath cloaks, servants hauling wood toward the kitchens, the occasional startled chicken regretting its life choices. Inside, the cold presses stubbornly through every crack in the stone. Even the brazier struggles today. The students huddle closer together on the benches while damp cloaks steam faintly near the fire. Wet boots line the wall beneath the windows, filling the room with the rich and unmistakable scent of medieval feet. A modern candle company would never survive selling authentic monastery winter as a fragrance. Master Aldrich enters carrying extra candles beneath one arm and immediately notices 3 boys trying to warm their hands directly over the brazier. "Unless you intend to roast yourselves for supper," he mutters, "sit properly." The boys obey with visible disappointment. Lessons continue despite the storm. They always continue. Medieval life rarely pauses for weather, unless roads become completely impassable or roofs physically collapse. And even then, people mostly complain while continuing anyway. Today's lessons feel slower than usual. Sleepiness drifts through the room like smoke. Candlelight flickers weakly against damp stone while snow taps softly against the shutters, hour after hour. You settle onto the familiar bench beside the younger students, pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The wool smells faintly of smoke and wet sheep, which, at this point, has become oddly comforting. Master Aldrich begins with recitation again. Latin prayers rise through the dim chamber in tired, uneven waves. One child yawns halfway through a psalm and accidentally transforms a holy phrase into something sounding suspiciously like a request for cabbage stew. Several nearby students collapse into muffled laughter behind their sleeves. Even Master Aldrich pauses. "Perhaps," he says dryly, "the saints also hunger before midday." The room quiets again, though grins linger. Outside the storm deepens. Wind pushes snow beneath the shutters in tiny white trails that melt slowly across the floor rushes. A novice stuffs scraps of wool into the gaps while muttering prayers against draughts. Some swear winter winds carry sickness directly into the lungs if allowed indoors unchecked. Others insist evil spirits ride storms searching for warm houses and sleeping children. Frankly, after enough cold nights, even you might begin believing weather has personal hatred. The lesson shifts toward copying lines onto wax tablets. Fingers move sluggishly now, stiffened by cold despite the brazier's glow. One younger boy keeps breathing onto his hands between letters, while another secretly sits on his own fingers for warmth whenever Master Aldrich turns away. Ingenious. You attempt writing again and discover the wax has hardened from the chill, making each letter scratch unevenly across the surface. Nearby quills splutter as thickened ink refuses cooperation. Medieval education truly believes suffering builds character. At the rear of the room, an older student coughs repeatedly into his sleeve. Several children edge subtly away from him on the bench. Illness spreads quickly during winter months in crowded monasteries. A boy whispers that garlic tied around the neck prevents fever. Another insists onions left beneath the bed absorb sickness overnight. A third claims sleeping beside church bells cures headaches because holy sound frightens pain away. No one can quite agree whether medieval remedies heal people or merely keep them occupied until recovery arrives naturally. The coughing student receives a cup of warmed ale mixed with honey from a passing monk. He drinks it gratefully before returning to his work, though his face remains pale beneath the candlelight. Master Aldrich notices everything, as always. During recitation, he quietly moves the sick boy nearer the brazier without drawing attention to it. The gesture is small enough most students miss entirely. You do not. Outside the windows, daylight fades early beneath the storm clouds. The schoolroom darkens long before evening bells arrive. More candles are lit, though tallow ones now instead of beeswax. The smell changes immediately heavier, greasier, carrying faint hints of animal fat beneath the smoke. One student wrinkles his nose dramatically. Another mutters that tallow candles smell like disappointed soup. Fair assessment. The hours stretch onward. Lessons slow further as exhaustion settles into every bench and corner. Wax tablets fill with cramped Latin lines. Quills scratch endlessly. The brazier hisses softly whenever melting snow drips from cloaks hanging too near the heat. You begin noticing the tiny discomforts medieval students simply endure daily. Fleas hiding in wool blankets, cold fingers splitting at the knuckles, smoke-stinging tired eyes, Wedhams brushing frozen ankles, hard benches pressing against aching backs. A younger child near you scratches constantly beneath his collar until another student warns him that too much scratching invites lice to dig deeper. Terrifying sentence, honestly. Yet despite everything, the lessons continue with strange steadiness. There is comfort in routine here. Bells mark the hours, candles burn down predictably, voices repeat familiar prayers, even storms become part of the rhythm. Master Aldrich eventually sets aside the manuscript and allows students a brief warming pause near the brazier. Children gather around it eagerly, stretching cramped hands toward the fading heat while steam rises from damp sleeves. One boy pulls from his pocket a tiny cloth bundle filled with dried lavender. "For sleep," he explains proudly. Another student snorts. "You sleep through prayers already." The first considers this carefully. Then it works. Laughter spreads softly through the room. Outside, twilight arrives almost unnoticed beneath the storm clouds. Snow continues falling beyond the windows, blurring monastery roofs into soft white shadows. Somewhere distant, the evening bell tolls low and mournful through the weather. The sound changes the room instantly. Lessons are ending. Students sag visibly with relief while gathering tablets, quills, and worn horn books into numb hands. Master Aldrich extinguishes candles one by one until only the brazier glows faintly red beneath the smoke-dark rafters. And as you step out into the freezing cloister beside weary children wrapped in damp cloaks while snow drifts silently through monastery arches, you begin to understand that medieval schooling was not merely about knowledge or discipline, but about enduring long, dark winters together through routine, prayer, warmth, and stubborn human persistence. The storm finally breaks sometime during the night. By dawn, the monastery lies buried beneath fresh snow that glows pale blue under the early morning sky. Icicles hang from roof edges like rows of glass knives, and every sound feels softened by the thick white silence covering the courtyard. Even the bells seem quieter somehow, though perhaps that is only because your ears remain half asleep beneath layers of wool and exhaustion. You cross the cloister with the other students while breath clouds before your faces in silver bursts. Boots crunch through frozen snow. Somewhere nearby, a stable boy hacks ice from water buckets, while muttering words that are almost certainly not official monastery prayers. Inside the schoolroom, warmth greets you weakly but sincerely. Fresh rushes have been scattered across the floor overnight, releasing a clean grassy scent beneath the usual smoke and damp wool. Candles flicker against the stone walls while the dog sleeps curled directly beside the brazier with the confidence of a creature utterly certain he belongs there. Today feels different immediately. The students notice it too. Near Master Aldrich's desk rests a small wooden reliquary decorated with brass trim and faded painted saints. Beside it stand sprigs of evergreen tied together with red thread. A feast day approaches, and medieval feast days alter everything. Lessons still happen, of course. Monasteries never fully abandon discipline, but the atmosphere softens slightly whenever holy celebrations draw near. Students whisper more, monks move faster through the corridors, kitchens smell better, even the bells seem less severe. Master Aldrich begins the morning lesson not with arithmetic or Latin recitation, but with stories of St. Jerome, patron of scholars and translators. The students sit unusually still while candlelight flickers across their sleepy faces. According to the tale, Jerome once removed a thorn from a lion's paw, after which the lion followed him faithfully for years. One younger student raises a cautious hand. "Master, why did the lion not simply eat him?" A fair theological question. Master Aldrich studies the child for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps," he says carefully, "because even lions occasionally need help reading difficult situations." The students laugh softly. The lesson continues. Stories matter deeply in medieval education because memory clings to narratives better than rules alone. Saints' lives become teaching tools filled with miracles, warnings, moral lessons, and enough dramatic suffering to terrify children into obedience for generations. Some stories grow stranger with repetition. One boy insists he heard of a saint who memorized entire books after an angel touched his tongue with fire. Another claims certain relics cure forgetfulness if kissed before examinations. A third swears monks in distant monasteries keep skulls that whisper answers to students during prayers. No one fully believes him. No one fully dismisses him either. The reliquary near the desk becomes the centre of attention once lessons shift toward prayer practice. Students pass before it one by one, bowing respectfully while murmuring Latin phrases beneath their breath. Inside rests a tiny bone fragment supposedly belonging to some long-dead holy figure. Which holy figure depends entirely on who tells the story. Relics in medieval Europe travel constantly through rumour, trade, theft, and extremely optimistic identification. Still, belief matters more than certainty here. You notice several students touch charms hidden beneath their tunics before reciting prayers. Tiny wooden saints, knotted cords blessed during pilgrimages. One boy carries a smooth river stone his mother insists protects against bad dreams and poor memory alike. Master Aldrich pretends not to notice most of these objects, perhaps because even learned men remain medieval men. The lesson shifts toward grammar next. Though grammar in monastery schools resembles a strange battlefield where children wrestle endlessly with Latin endings, while half-frozen fingers clutch wax tablets in despair. Nominative, Master Aldrich says. The students answer in weary unison. Genitive. Another response. Dative. At least 3 boys visibly lose the will to live. Latin grammar governs educated medieval life. Church records, legal documents, scripture, correspondence, everything important flows through it. yet the language itself twists and bends in maddening ways for students raised speaking entirely different tongues. One child accidentally declines a noun so badly, another whispers that he has probably summoned demons by mistake. Honestly, that may explain several historical events. Outside the windows, sunlight finally breaks through the clouds, sending pale gold across the snowy courtyard. The brightness transforms the room. Dust glitters in the air above the benches. Meltwater drips softly from the roof outside. For the first time in days, warmth almost touches the monastery stones. A novice enters carrying small cups of warmed cider mixed with cloves for the students. The feast day generosity has already begun. Children accept the drinks with expressions normally reserved for divine visions. Steam curls upward, carrying sharp, sweet spice through the room. One boy sighs so happily you would think he had inherited a kingdom. Master Aldrich allows the brief distraction before returning to grammar lessons once more. Students copy declensions onto wax tablets while muttering endings beneath their breath like exhausted monks casting spells. Yet the atmosphere remains lighter now. A younger child secretly places evergreen beneath his tablet because his grandmother claims winter plants help thoughts stay alive during difficult lessons. Another student quietly hangs a tiny pilgrim badge near the desk for scholarly luck. No one removes it. Some swear feast days weaken evil spirits and make learning easier because saints walk closer to the living during holy seasons. Others argue students simply behave better when promised sweetbread afterward. A compelling theory. As afternoon approaches, the bells ring more frequently across the monastery. Servants decorate the chapel with greenery while monks rehearse hymns drifting faintly through the corridors. The entire monastery seems to breathe differently during feast preparations. Even Master Aldrich appears less severe. During recitation, one nervous boy completely forgets his grammar lines halfway through and accidentally substitutes a prayer for travellers instead. The room falls silent. Then the master merely says, "Useful if your verbs intend to leave." The students nearly collapse, trying not to laugh aloud. Outside, ravens wheel across the bright snowfields beyond the walls while sunlight glitters against frozen rooftops. Winter still rules the world here, but for a little while candles burn warmer, food tastes richer, and lessons soften beneath the nearness of holy celebration. And as you sit among weary students chanting Latin endings beside relics, charms, evergreen branches, and flickering candles beneath the ringing monastery bells, you begin to understand how medieval schooling blended scholarship with superstition, faith with routine, and sacred wonder with the ordinary exhaustion of daily life. A few days later, you leave the monastery behind beneath a pale winter dawn, following Master Aldrich and several older students along the frozen road toward the nearest market town. Snow still lingers in the ditches and beneath hedgerows, though the roads themselves have turned to deep brown mud where wagon wheels and horses churn the thawing earth into rutted misery. Your boots sink with every step. A cart passes splashing filthy water across your cloak, and the driver barely glances back. Medieval transportation truly excels at building character through dampness. The monastery bells fade slowly behind you as the town rises ahead, timber roofs clustered behind stout stone walls, smoke curling upward into the grey morning sky. Even from a distance you hear it already: dogs barking, merchants shouting, iron striking iron somewhere near the smithy. After the measured silence of monastery life, the town feels almost overwhelming. You pass through the gatehouse beneath watchful guards wrapped in fur-lined cloaks. A toll collector sits nearby beneath an awning, scratching figures onto parchment while muttering over coins with the haunted expression shared by accountants across all centuries. Inside the walls, life crowds every street. Fishmongers lay out salted herring on wooden stalls while bakers haul steaming loaves from ovens into the cold air. Chickens scatter beneath carts. Apprentices carry bundles of cloth nearly larger than themselves. Smoke, horse dung, ale, wet wool, and roasting onions mingle into one unmistakably medieval smell. The students around you stare openly despite pretending not to. Town schools differ greatly from monastery schools. Less silence, less prayer, more urgency. Education here serves trade, guilds, legal records, and civic life as much as religion. Merchants need clerks, courts need scribes, shops need apprentices capable of counting coin properly, instead of accidentally selling 3 barrels for the price of 1. You follow the group through narrow streets slick with mud until a tall timber building comes into view beside the guild hall. Its upper windows lean slightly outward over the road, and faded Latin words are painted above the entrance. The town school? Children spill from the doorway already, boys mostly, though you glimpse 2 girls near the back carrying writing tablets beneath wool cloaks. Their families must possess unusual wealth or determination. Possibly both. Inside. The schoolroom feels louder immediately than the monastery ever did. Benches crowd together beneath smoke-dark rafters, while voices bounce off timber walls in constant restless noise. The air smells strongly of ink, wet leather, and humanity packed too closely together. A cat sleeps directly atop a stack of parchment near the teacher's desk. No one seems able to move it. The master here, unlike Aldrich, dresses in layered wool robes trimmed with decent fur. Rings flash on his fingers when he gestures, and his beard appears carefully combed, suspiciously luxurious by monastery standards. This is Master Hugh. He radiates the energy of a man who enjoys both scholarship and charging fees for it. Students recite lessons loudly while apprentices in merchant colours scratch numbers onto wax tablets. Some practice signatures repeatedly. Others copy legal phrases or trade contracts from hanging sheets pinned near the walls. The noise never fully stops. After monastery discipline, the chaos feels almost festive. One boy argues openly about grain prices during arithmetic practice. Another falls asleep upright against a beam while still clutching a quill. Near the windows, 2 students quietly gamble chestnuts over a spelling exercise until Master Hugh confiscates both the nuts and the dignity of everyone involved. Education, he announces dryly, already costs enough. The town students laugh. You notice differences immediately between these children and the monastery boys. Their clothing varies more widely, merchant sons in dyed wool cloaks, apprentice boys wearing guild badges stitched onto sleeves, poorer students wrapped in patched garments still carrying the smell of workshop smoke. Several older boys already possess ink-stained hands roughened by labour outside lessons. School here exists alongside work, not apart from it. One apprentice leaves midway through the morning to assist at his father's stall in the market square. Another arrives late carrying bolts of cloth through the snow before sliding breathlessly onto the bench. Master Hugh barely pauses the lesson. Time is money in towns. Literally. Arithmetic dominates much of the day. Students calculate trade weights, market tolls, interest on loans, and shipping costs along river routes. Wax tablets fill with columns of figures while tally sticks clack against desks. One boy mutters that fractions were invented by the devil to punish merchants specifically. A compelling academic theory. Outside the windows the market swells noisily toward midday. You glimpse jugglers near the square, pilgrims buying hot pies beside roadside shrines, and traders shouting over wool prices beneath striped awnings. The schoolroom absorbs that energy constantly. Lessons pause whenever carts crash outside or guild bells ring nearby. Students know current market prices better than monastery feast days. Master Hugh even uses real trade disputes as examples during lessons. If a cooper cheats you on barrel size, he asks, how much ale have you lost? Practical education. Potentially tragic ale loss. A younger student near you keeps rubbing a tiny brass coin for luck before difficult sums. Another secretly touches the rabbit foot tied beneath his belt whenever called to recite. Town children possess just as many superstitions as monastery boys, only noisier ones. Some swear carrying nutmeg prevents cheating during trade negotiations. Others believe ravens perched near market crosses predict bad business weeks ahead. One apprentice insists left-handed scribes bring terrible luck to contracts. Unfortunately, he himself is left-handed. The town school also teaches manners useful for civic life: proper greetings, respectful letter forms, legal phrases, even controlled speaking during disputes. Merchant families want sons capable of navigating guild halls without embarrassing themselves publicly. An ambitious goal for adolescents in any century. By afternoon, the room grows warmer and louder still. Mud dries on boots beneath benches. Candles sputter beside open account books. Master Hugh strides between rows, correcting figures with rapid impatience, while outside the market bells ring across the square. A dog wanders inside briefly, carrying a sausage twice the length of its own head, before 3 apprentices chase it screaming into the street. No one entirely stops the lesson, and as you sit among shouting students, clattering tally sticks, muddy apprentices, market smells, guild banners, and endless arithmetic beneath the restless noise of the town, you begin to understand how medieval schools changed depending on where they stood, monasteries shaping souls through prayer and discipline, while towns shaped clerks, merchants, and survivors for the noisy practical world beyond church walls. You leave the town several mornings later beneath a sky the colour of old pewter, joining a small group of older students travelling north along the Pilgrim Road toward a cathedral city where greater schools and perhaps even a university wait beyond the winter hills. The road itself barely deserves the name. Frozen ruts twist through muddy fields and patches of forest, where bare branches creak overhead in the wind. Meltwater gathers in potholes deep enough to drown optimism entirely. Every traveller you pass looks cold, tired, suspicious, or all three. Medieval roads are excellent teachers of humility. The student company numbers only 6 besides yourself. 2 merchant sons hoping to study law, a thin monastery novice carrying more books than food, 1 broad-shouldered boy destined for cathedral administration if he survives the journey without arguing with every living creature first, which currently seems uncertain. They travel wrapped in patch cloaks with satchels hanging heavily at their sides, wax tablets, parchment scraps, prayer books, dried bread, and small personal charms rattle together with every step. You quickly discover student travel in the medieval world is less grand intellectual adventure and more controlled suffering interrupted by occasional soup. The road passes frozen fields where peasants chop dead stalks from winter soil while crows circle overhead. Smoke rises from distant villages clustered around tiny churches and muddy commons. Here and there roadside shrines appear beside the path, weathered saints blackened by rain and candle smoke, their stone faces softened by centuries of wind. Travellers pause often at these shrines. Some cross themselves. Some leave coins. One student quietly presses his fingers against a carved saint before continuing onward. For safe roads, he explains. Another mutters, you should ask for dry ones instead. A wise amendment. By midday, snow begins falling lightly again, drifting through the trees while the students trudge onward beneath wool hoods. Their conversation turns toward famous scholars they hope someday to hear lecture in cathedral halls. One speaks reverently of a master in Paris capable of quoting entire books from memory. Another claims Oxford students once held debates lasting through the entire night without sleep. A third insists scholars in Bologna survive mainly on wine and arrogance. Honestly, believable. The monastery novice walking beside you carries a tiny leather pouch tied around his neck. Inside rests a sliver of saint's bone wrapped carefully in cloth. "Against thieves," he says quietly. "Does it work?" He considers, "I still have the bone." Fair enough. The road grows busier approaching evening. Pilgrims shuffle southward wearing badges sewn onto hats and cloaks. Merchants guide pack mules through the mud while muttering about toll collectors. A group of armed retainers passes without acknowledging anyone. Horses splashing filthy water across the frozen roadside. One older student immediately checks whether his purse remains tied securely beneath his cloak. Travel teachers caution quickly. At dusk, the group reaches a roadside inn crouched beside a bridge crossing a narrow river. Warm yellow light spills from shuttered windows while smoke billows thickly from the chimney into the darkening sky. The sign above the door creaks in the wind, painted with a faded red stag barely visible beneath years of rain. Inside, heat and noise crash over you together. Travellers crowd the common room shoulder to shoulder beneath soot-black rafters. Wet cloaks steam near the hearth while serving girls weave between benches carrying bowls of stew and heavy mugs of ale. The smell of onions, damp leather, wood smoke, and muddy boots settles thick as fog. A musician somewhere near the back plucks lazily at a lute missing at least one string. The students claim a narrow bench near the fire and immediately begin thawing themselves like abandoned laundry. You notice how poor most travelling scholars truly are. Their cloaks are patched repeatedly, their boots leak. One boy carefully counts remaining coins beneath the table before ordering the cheapest stew available. Education beyond monastery schools cost enormous sums, not only tuition, but travel, lodging, food, candles, books. Knowledge itself becomes a kind of pilgrimage. The innkeeper serves thick barley stew with turnips and bits of salted pork floating through it like rare treasures. Hard bread follows alongside weak ale watered enough to offend serious drinkers everywhere. Still, nobody complains. Hunger outranks dignity on the road. Around the fire, older travellers trade stories while snow rattles softly against the shutters outside. A merchant describes bandits near the northern forests. A pilgrim swears he saw miraculous lights above a shrine last winter. One scarred man claims university students in Paris fight duels using grammar books. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether anyone survived the footnotes. The students listen eagerly. Travel broadens education long before formal lessons begin. Later in the evening, the monastery novice produces a tiny manuscript from his satchel and begins reviewing Latin passages beside the firelight. Another student joins him reluctantly while muttering declensions beneath his breath. Even exhausted travellers study. The broad-shouldered cathedral candidate notices you watching and shrugs. "If you arrive ignorant," he says, "the masters enjoy proving it publicly." Terrifying educational philosophy. Nearby, a serving girl watches the students curiously while wiping tables with a damp cloth. "You boys heading to the schools?" They nod. "My cousin studied letters once," she says. "Came home speaking so much Latin nobody trusted him afterward." A genuine occupational hazard. Outside, the wind strengthens again. The bridge timbers creak faintly over the dark river while snow swirls through the inn yard. Horses stamp in the stable beyond the walls. Somewhere upstairs, travellers argue about room space in at least 3 different accents. The students gradually fall quieter around the fire. One rubs rosemary leaves between his fingers before reciting grammar rules softly from memory. Another touches the saint's relic at his neck before sleep. A third ties knots into a leather cord while reviewing legal phrases because his mother insists knots help hold knowledge inside the mind during travel. No one laughs at these habits anymore. The road makes believers of people quickly. At last the innkeeper extinguishes several candles and travellers drift towards straw mattresses or narrow floor spaces near the hearth. The students wrap themselves in cloaks beside the fading fire, boots drying awkwardly nearby while snow whispers against the shutters. Tomorrow the road continues north toward cathedral bells, crowded lecture halls, and greater schools waiting somewhere beyond the frozen countryside. And as you lie listening to tired scholars breathing softly beside the hearth, beneath drifting smoke and distant winter wind, you begin to understand that medieval education was not simply learned in classrooms, but carried painfully across muddy roads by students willing to trade comfort, safety, and certainty for even the smallest chance at knowledge. Morning arrives grey and wet beside the roadside inn. The snow from yesterday has melted into deep brown slush coating the yard outside, and travellers stumble sleepily toward the stables beneath a steady drizzle that seems personally offended by human happiness. Smoke drifts low across the bridge, while somewhere nearby a mule screams with the emotional intensity of a cursed soul. The students wake stiff and sore from sleeping beside the common room hearth. Cloaks smell strongly of smoke now, and one boy discovers another traveller accidentally used his satchel as a pillow during the night. Fortunately, the manuscripts inside survive. Barely, after a breakfast of coarse bread, weak ale, and cheese hard enough to challenge basic dentistry, the group continues northward through the rain. The road gradually widens as more travellers appear heading toward the cathedral city ahead. Pilgrims, merchants, messengers splattered with mud to the eyebrows, and students, so many students. You begin noticing them everywhere now, young men in patched scholar robes carrying bundles of parchment beneath cloaks, arguing loudly in Latin while slipping through puddles with alarming regularity. Some travel alone, others cluster in noisy groups debating theology, law, or which inns water down their ale most aggressively. One thin scholar passes muttering grammar rules to himself so intensely he nearly walks directly into a sheep. Education remains dangerous. By afternoon, the cathedral city finally appears beyond the rain, rising from the grey landscape in layers of stone walls, towers, chimneys, and bells. At its centre stands the cathedral itself, enormous even through the mist, its spires vanishing into low clouds like something half built by giants. The students beside you fall silent. Even exhausted travellers straighten slightly at the sight. Cities built around cathedral schools feel different from ordinary towns, larger, louder, more crowded with ambition. Everywhere you look, people carry books, documents, ink pots, or satchels stuffed with parchment. Knowledge here has become an industry. The gates swallow you into streets crowded with apprentices, clerics, vendors, beggars, scribes, and wandering scholars from distant regions. Church bells ring constantly from multiple towers, overlapping across the rooftops in a confusion of sound. The smells arrive next. Hot bread, horse dung, rain-soaked wool, fish markets, lamp smoke, wet parchment, and beneath everything, humanity packed tightly together inside stone streets. One student murmurs a prayer against thieves while gripping his satchel tighter beneath his cloak. Wise instinct. The cathedral school lies beside the massive church itself within a cluster of narrow buildings connected by covered walks and cramped courtyards. Students swarm everywhere, arguing beneath archways, hurrying between lessons, eating pies beside staircases, or sleeping openly against walls with books still in hand. No one appears fully rested. A comforting academic tradition. Inside the main lecture hall, warmth battles unsuccessfully against the damp air drifting through high stone windows. Rows of benches climb steeply upward around a central speaking platform where a master already lectures in rapid Latin, while students scratch notes furiously onto wax tablets. The noise astonishes you. Not disorder exactly, but intensity. Questions fly openly across the hall. Students interrupt each other. Arguments erupt halfway through explanations. Some scholars quote ancient authorities with almost religious passion, while others openly challenge interpretations. At one point, two students begin shouting over the correct translation of a legal phrase, until the master silences both by throwing a chalk fragment directly between them without pausing the lecture. Impressive aim. You settle beside the travelling students from the road while the lecture continues around you in dizzying waves of logic and debate. This is no monastery recitation now. The lessons move faster, sharper, hungrier. Knowledge here is pursued almost aggressively. The master poses a question concerning theology and free will. Immediately, half the room erupts into argument. One scholar leaps to his feet citing Augustine. Another counters with Aristotle. A third appears mostly interested in winning loudly regardless of accuracy. The atmosphere crackles with exhaustion and ambition combined. Some swear medieval university debates occasionally lasted until sunrise. Others insist students continued arguing even in their sleep. Looking round the hall, you find both claims entirely believable. Wax tablets fill rapidly with notes. Quills scratch against parchment. Rain taps softly at the windows while candles flicker in iron holders along the walls. The students beside you whisper explanations whenever the lecture becomes impossibly dense. Do not challenge a master directly unless invited. Pretend confidence even when confused. If someone quotes 4 authorities in one sentence, simply nod. Practical survival advice. During a brief pause, scholars crowd toward braziers warming chilled hands while continuing arguments uninterrupted. One boy from Italy debates astronomy with a French student beside the fire, while a weary English scholar nearby mutters that both are idiots. International education thrives beautifully. You notice many students carry little personal rituals into the lecture hall just as monastery children did. A knotted cord wrapped around the wrist for memory, rosemary tucked into sleeves, tiny saint medals hidden beneath robes. One nervous scholar kisses a relic ring before every disputation. Another refuses to write with any quill except one trimmed personally on a saint's feast day. Education grows more sophisticated here. Superstitions absolutely do not. Evening approaches before the final disputation begins. Candles burn brighter now against the darkening hall while rainwater drips steadily from cloaks hung near the entrance. The master presents a formal question, then calls students forward to defend opposing positions publicly before the assembly. The tension changes instantly. This matters. A thin student steps forward first, pale with nerves yet speaking rapidly in polished Latin. Another responds sharply, dismantling his argument point by point while the hall murmurs approval or disapproval beneath the candlelight. You realize these debates are performances as much as scholarship, wit, confidence, memory, rhetoric, everything matters. One student loses his place midway through an argument and freezes completely. The silence becomes unbearable. Then from somewhere near the back, another scholar quietly coughs the opening word of the forgotten quotation. The speaker recovers immediately. No acknowledgement passes between them. Yet the small kindness lingers. Outside, cathedral bells toll through the rainy dusk while students continue debating beneath smoke-dark beams and flickering candlelight. Some look exhausted enough to collapse, others glow with excitement despite the cold and hunger. And as you sit listening to scholars arguing theology beside dripping cloaks, smoking braziers, cramped benches, and endless Latin beneath the towering cathedral bells, you begin to understand how medieval education transformed here into something larger than discipline or trade, a restless world of ideas pursued with equal parts brilliance, stubbornness, pride, and sleepless determination. The cathedral city never truly sleeps. Even deep into the night, footsteps echo through the narrow streets outside the scholars' lodging house, while bells drift across the rooftops from distant towers marking the passing hours. Rainwater trickles along gutters, somewhere nearby. Drunken apprentices sing badly in at least 2 languages. A dog barks, a baby cries. Someone argues passionately about Aristotle through a wall thin enough to share every syllable. You lie awake beneath a rough wool blanket listening to the sounds of learning and poverty tangled together. Because despite all the grand debates and towering cathedrals, most medieval students live very close to hunger. Morning reveals this immediately. The lodging house common room fills with pale, exhausted scholars clutching stale bread and watered ale, while counting coins with expressions of quiet despair. Candles cost money. Ink costs money. Firewood costs money. Lectures cost money. Even the straw mattresses seem determined to charge rent personally. One student near the hearth turns out his purse and produces exactly 3 pennies, a button, and what might possibly be a dried bean. Not an encouraging financial portfolio. The travelling companions you arrived with fare little better. The merchant sons receive occasional support from home, though even they speak anxiously about expenses. The monastery novice copies texts for extra coin whenever lessons end. The broad-shouldered future cathedral official has begun tutoring younger boys in grammar during evenings to pay for meals. Education here survives through endless small sacrifices. You accompany the students through rain-dark streets toward the cathedral schools, while market vendors shout beneath striped awnings and chimney smoke drifts low across the city. Beggars cluster near church doors. Apprentices haul barrels through puddles. Everywhere you look, money changes hands. Or fails to. A narrow lane beside the cathedral has become known informally as Scholars' Row, because poor students rent tiny rooms there barely larger than cupboards. Laundry hangs from windows overhead, while booksellers display second-hand manuscripts beneath canvas covers. You stop beside one such stall. The prices are staggering. A single copied text costs more than many labourers earn in months. Even partial manuscripts require serious sacrifice. Students crowd around anyway, examining worn pages with aching longing. One scholar carefully copies passages by hand directly onto scraps of parchment because he cannot afford the actual book. Another shares textbooks with 3 roommates, each memorizing sections before passing them along. Knowledge spreads slowly when every page must be earned. No one can quite agree whether medieval scholars spent more time studying or desperately finding ways to continue studying another week. Inside the lecture halls, the atmosphere feels sharper now that you recognize what hangs beneath it all: ambition, anxiety, hope, exhaustion. Students argue fiercely because education might genuinely alter their lives. A poor village boy who masters law could someday advise nobles. A merchant's son skilled in letters might rise into royal administration. A clever monastery student could become bishop, scholar, diplomat, or fail completely and return home carrying only debt and opinions. The uncertainty follows everyone. During a midday pause, you share a bench near the cathedral cloister with several students eating cold onions, bread crusts, and thin slices of cheese wrapped in cloth. Rain drips steadily from the arches nearby while bells toll above. One older scholar admits he has not visited home in 3 years because travel costs too much. Another confesses he copies legal contracts late into the night until his fingers cramp so badly he cannot hold a spoon properly afterward. A third laughs bitterly. At least spoons are cheaper than books. True. The monastery novice beside you removes his precious manuscript carefully from its wrapping to study during the meal, despite the damp air threatening the parchment edges. You carry that everywhere, someone says. If I leave it behind, he replies, someone wealthier may discover it. A terrible but practical concern. You begin noticing how worn many scholars truly are, elbows patched repeatedly, boots repaired with mismatched leather, ink stains impossible to remove from cuffs, hollow-eyed students sleeping briefly against chapel walls between lectures. Learning here consumes people. Yet the city also hums with strange excitement impossible to ignore. Ideas travel constantly through these streets alongside merchants and pilgrims. New arguments, new translations, new theories copied from distant lands. One bookseller whispers excitedly about mathematical texts arriving from the south. Another claims physicians in foreign universities study human anatomy using actual bodies, instead of relying entirely on ancient authorities. Several students react as though hearing dangerous witchcraft. Medieval education expands slowly, unevenly, but relentlessly. By evening, the rain finally clears. Pale sunset glows briefly behind cathedral towers while students gather in taverns, lodgings, and cramped study rooms throughout the city. You follow your companions into a narrow rented chamber beneath the roof of a crooked timber house. The room contains 2 mattresses, 4 scholars, 6 candles, and approximately no remaining oxygen once the door closes. A brazier glows weakly near the wall. Wax drips steadily across cluttered tables piled with parchment scraps and borrowed texts. One student recites legal phrases aloud while another practices theological arguments beneath his breath. The monastery novice copies lines carefully despite aching fingers wrapped in cloth. Outside the window, cathedral bells ring through the darkening city. Inside, scholarship continues stubbornly. One exhausted student ties knots into a leather cord while memorizing grammar rules, because his grandmother insisted knots trap knowledge before it escapes overnight. Another burns rosemary near the brazier to clear sleepy thoughts. A third keeps a pilgrim badge pinned above the table, because he believes St. Catherine helps scholars during examinations. No one mocks these habits anymore. Even the brightest medieval minds carry charms against uncertainty. The candles burn lower. Arguments fade into weary murmurs. Rainwater drips from the roof somewhere overhead while the city outside softens gradually towards sleep beneath drifting smoke and distant bells. And as you watch tired students studying by failing candlelight in cramped rented rooms filled with patched cloaks, borrowed books, aching hands, and impossible hopes, you begin to understand the true cost of medieval education, not merely coins or years, but the willingness to endure discomfort, loneliness, and uncertainty for the fragile belief that knowledge might somehow build a different future. Winter slowly loosens its grip on the cathedral city. Not all at once. Medieval seasons never change politely, but little signs begin appearing in corners of ordinary days: meltwater, dripping steadily from roof edges, softer mud beneath wagon wheels, market stalls lingering later into the evening light. The air still bites with cold after sunset, yet somewhere beneath the damp stone and chimney smoke you can smell thawing earth, waiting patiently beneath the snow. You return at last to a quieter schoolroom near the cathedral cloister, smaller than the great lecture halls and calmer than the noisy town schools below the market streets. Candles burn low against familiar stone walls, while students bend silently over wax tablets and parchment scraps in the fading afternoon light. The room feels tired, not unhappy, simply worn smooth by months of lessons. Master Aldrich is here too, having travelled south again with monastery business. Seeing him beside the brazier feels strangely comforting now, like finding an old tree still standing after a long winter journey. His robe remains ink-stained. His fingers still carry faint black marks along the joints. The birch rod hangs forgotten at his belt while he quietly reviews copied texts beside the fire. Around you, students work with the calm exhaustion of people who have repeated the same rituals so long they no longer notice them fully. Quills scratching, pages turning, candles hissing softly, bells tolling beyond the walls. A younger boy murmurs Latin endings beneath his breath while tying knots into a cord for memory. Another keeps rosemary tucked into his sleeve despite dried leaves crumbling steadily onto the bench. Near the window, one student touches a small saint's medal before beginning a difficult passage. The habits remain. The fears remain. The hopes remain too. Outside, cathedral bells drift through the soft grey evening while smoke rises from hundreds of chimneys across the city rooftops. Market noise has quieted now. Merchants close shutters. Apprentices carry lanterns through muddy lanes. Somewhere distant, laughter spills briefly from a tavern before fading into the damp spring air. Inside the schoolroom, the dog sleeps beside the brazier once more. Older now, perhaps, or maybe merely wiser. He twitches occasionally in dreams while students step carefully around him. No one wakes him. You sit quietly at the long wooden bench where so many lessons have passed beneath winter candles and monastery bells. The surface beneath your hands feels worn smooth by generations of restless fingers. Children have learned prayers here, grammar here, numbers here. They have shivered through storms, copied letters by failing light, hidden charms beneath cloaks, and fallen asleep over wax tablets while masters sighed into the smoke-dark rafters. Some became scribes, some merchants, some priests. Some vanished back into ordinary village life, carrying only fragments of Latin and memories of cold classrooms. No one can quite agree what becomes of most medieval students after the lessons end. History remembers only a few names. The rest dissolve quietly into the centuries like breath fading in winter air. Master Aldrich closes a manuscript softly and begins extinguishing candles one by one. Each small flame disappears with a thin curl of smoke, leaving the room dimmer and calmer. No hurry now. The day is ending. The season too, perhaps. A boy near the front bench yawns so deeply his entire body folds forward like collapsing laundry. Another smiles sleepily over a successfully copied page before resting his forehead against folded arms. The bells continue outside. Slow, steady, familiar. You realize how much of medieval education is simply rhythm. Waking bells, prayer bells, meal bells, lesson bells. Candles burning down while voices repeat old words learned from older voices still. Winter following autumn, spring following winter. Generations seated upon the same benches beneath the same rafters, listening to the same prayers carried carefully forward through time. The room grows quieter. Someone adds another piece of wood to the brazier. Sparks rise briefly, glowing gold before fading into shadow. Warmth spreads softly across tired hands and aching backs. A student near the window whispers the final lines of a prayer almost absent-mindedly now. More habit than performance. Another carefully wraps a manuscript in cloth before placing it safely away from damp air and careless elbows. Outside, evening mist gathers between the cathedral towers. The city softens. Footsteps fade along the cloister walk. Even the bells seem farther away now. Master Aldrich settles slowly onto the bench nearest the fire with the exhausted heaviness of a man who has spent his life carrying knowledge carefully from one winter into the next. For a while he says nothing at all. The students continue gathering their belongings quietly around him. Then at last he speaks, almost to himself. "Let us survive," he murmurs. "That is enough." No grand speech follows. No dramatic ending. Only the soft crackle of the brazier and the rustle of cloaks in the dim light. One by one the students drift from the room into the quiet cathedral corridors beyond, carrying tablets, books, and sleepy thoughts into the deepening evening. Their footsteps fade gradually beneath distant bells until only you, the old schoolmaster, and the sleeping dog remain beside the fire. The last candles burn low. Wax pools softly at their bases. Smoke curls lazily upward into the darkness of the rafters. And now the world itself seems to slow around you. The cold stone walls no longer feel harsh, only still. The drifting smoke smells warm and ancient, somewhere far away. Bells continue their patient conversation with the night, while beyond the city walls wet fields wait silently for spring. You imagine all the countless children who once sat in rooms like this across the medieval world, cold hands wrapped around quills, sleepy voices repeating Latin before dawn, little charms hidden beneath tunics, bread crusts saved for later, dreams carried carefully through muddy roads, monastery gates, crowded markets, and candle-lit libraries. Most of them are forgotten now. Yet for a little while tonight you have walked beside them. The fire settles lower. Orange embers pulse softly in the dark. The old master finally rises, gathers the last manuscript beneath his arm, and pauses beside the doorway while the bells ring once more through the quiet evening air. Then even he disappears into the dim corridor beyond. The room falls still. Only the brazier glows faintly now beside the sleeping dog. Outside, rain begins gently somewhere beyond the cloister roof, soft as whispered prayers against stone. And slowly, beneath the fading warmth, the drifting smoke, and the faraway bells of the medieval night, the long journey settles softly into silence.